I found this page listing off a group of Pokemon considered to be the Semi-Pseudo Legendary Pokemon in all the Pokemon. But when I first looked at it, the first thing I thought was, what do you mean Caparaja? And because I saw something I disagreed with, I had to make a whole video. Okay, I'm not even joking, the official page had Caparaja on it at one point until it was removed, but I wrote this intro on July 13th, 2020. They knew I was coming for them. Semi-Pseudo Legendary Pokemon can describe a group of Pokemon that stand out from just regular Pokemon that don't have their own official classification, but the fans of Pokemon would definitely agree that they stand out. There are many different groups of Pokemon that all have different feelings attributed to the Pokemon in their categories. All of these Pokemon categories manage to give off a different vibe, but there's still quite a few Pokemon in each generation that also have a different feeling to them compared to their Pokédex spots. We go into the one Pokemon from each generation that could possibly be considered semi-pseudo legendary, just slightly below pseudo legendary, but still special in its own way. These are the real semi-pseudo legendary Pokemon in every game. Before we begin, today's video is brought to you by Manscaped.com. Manscaped was kind enough to hook me up with a bunch of tools and formulations from their all-in-one performance package kit. I've been really excited by their new Lawnmower 3.0 that has a waterproof trimmer with advanced skin-safe technology. It even has an LED light to keep you feeling lit up the entire time. I remember when I was in my shower and the lights burnt out. Thanks to the Lawnmower 3.0's LED light, I was not only able to locate my way out of the shower, but also see the supple, clean shave it helped me obtain, even in the dark. The package also includes the Weed Whacker nose and ear trimmer to clean out those hard-to-reach spots and fully take in the wonderful smells of the Crop Preserver deodorant and ball toner spray that comes with it. Manscaped didn't forget about a nice little suave nail kit, which is actually the nicest, smoothest looking kit I've ever had. I might use this as a wallet. And for just a limited time, you can get all of this plus 2 free gifts with a Shed travel bag and the Manscaped anti-chafing boxer briefs. Go to manscaped.com today and get 20% off plus free international shipping and these 2 free gifts when you use my promo code Jethro20 at manscaped.com. Generation 1 starts things off with a bang, as when looking at this wiki list, you can see not a single Generation 1 Pokemon is listed. They have Kingdra for Generation 2, which evolves from a Generation 1 Pokemon, but you can't find a single Gen 1 Pokemon that can fit the classification of Semi-Pseudo Legendary, which is made up, by the way. Arcanine works, but I mean in theory it does have the species of Legendary Pokemon, so if it was a Semi-Pseudo Legendary Pokemon on top of that, it would actually be a Pseudo Legendary, Semi-Pseudo Legendary, Legendary Species Pokemon, because it has that as a species. However, as a Pokemon on its own, it does stand out as different from the rest in its own special way. There's also Gyarados, who has that coming-of-age story from a common carp, and is always on an important character's team. But my pick for Generation 1 Semi-Pseudo Legendary Pokemon is Lapras. Lapras always had that somewhat close to legendary feeling in the way that it felt like a step above most common Pokemon, while being just a category down from the long list of subcategories in Pokemon like legendaries and mythical. It was magical in its own way, became the icon of Surf, and was also obtained in a different way without being available in the wild in the original Gen 1 games. Maybe it doesn't have a baby Pokemon like Lucario or a full evolution line, or anything really, but this is a made up category. I'm just picking Pokemon that can fit the description the best. And Lapras definitely had that mystical appeal compared to the rest of the Gen 1 Pokedex, in the same way Pikachu stood out without its own category, aside from being a starter Pokemon in that one spin-off game. Sorry, 2 spin-off games, and the anime. Generation 2 is one that I disagree with. I don't know how Kingdra gets in here. I mean, in a sense, I can see the appeal of Kingdra, so it's not the worst pick like when Caparaja was there a year ago, but I don't really think a Pokemon that's an evolution from previous generation Pokemon would really fit the category when it's something like Semi-Pseudo Legendary Pokemon. I think Kingdra does have an appeal, and it is an unexpected dragon Pokemon, but I still can't justify Kingdra as a pick based on its pre-evolutions. I picked Skarmory for this generation. It was hard to encounter, hard to catch. When Skarmory was on somebody's team, you knew that they meant business. And I know a lot of people mistook Skarmory for being a legendary bird. Again, I don't think you need pre-evolutions to be a part of this category, and I'm sort of defining semi-pseudo legendary in my own way, but if anything, if you were to go blindly into Pokemon, then it'd be likely that you think Skarmory had its own subcategory in one way or another just from your first encounter. Look, I know it's Generation 3, but you don't have to pick 3 Pokemon for this. Also, what? Aggron and Slacking? I don't know what either of those Pokemon have as qualities for one step down from pseudo-legendaries. Maybe Slacking has crazy high stats, but that's really just its ability gimmick. You might as well pick any 3-stage Pokemon at this point. Even Gardevoir is a better pick, and realistically isn't a bad choice compared to these two. Also, how could you not choose Milotic? This is almost a Lucario of Generation 3. I would have to say if I'm just picking one, I'll agree with Flygon. Maybe only slightly ahead of Milotic. Flygon definitely has that semi-pseudo legendary clutch factor when it's a full stage dragon Pokemon in the middle of nowhere and the first fully evolved ground dragon type before Garchomp stole the patent. In a sense, I think semi-pseudo legendary is a term that should be used for Pokemon who either have their own specialized yet different type of spotlight, or ones that actually can be mistaken for one of these categories. The same way Skarmory was mistaken for a legendary bird, and the way that Flygon might have been mistaken for an actual pseudo-legendary. It is a weaker Garchomp, so it has that little brother effect, and in a way, it does stand out as a dragon type, as Trapinch is common to find. However, you don't expect it to become a dragon in its final evolution, so it has that surprise factor. I think that special factor would be the feeling you'd want for a semi-pseudo legendary Pokemon, so Gen 3 gets Flygon. We get to Generation 4 and you all know who's the semi-pseudo-legendary Pokemon that this generation would have. That's right, it's Cardivine! Woo! Who could have guessed it? That's right, you guys! Who the hell needs Lucario? Wait, one second, I can't see the rest of my script. When you can fly on wings of mixed greens, how'd I forget that? Look at that smile! How can you reject a Pokemon with this kind of personality for this topic of conversation? I would be honored to be trapped in its mouth. Alright, it's actually Lucario, but what else was I going to talk about in this section? This is the most obvious, barely any competition pick that would define the category and topic of this video in such a light that I might as well put it on the thumbnail. Really, I can see Lucario being the Pokemon that stemmed this whole page, as it is for sure a Pokemon that has a special connotation to it without being in any special category. It has its own main character vibe that defines its placement in Generation 4 in a way that can only be brought to light by making a whole wiki page with a new category for it. It has the same effect that Zoroark had in Generation 5. I call it the Pikachu effect. Yeah, these two even got movies, yeah, that's the Pokemon Company's nod towards how special these two are, and yeah, Zoroark is in the next section, so here we are in Generation 5. This is actually the most difficult generation. They actually managed to pick 3 Pokemon that I chose myself because when you look at these, they all have different defining characteristics that would display what the classification focuses on. Haxorus is a strong 3-stage dragon line without the pseudo-legendary classification. Volcarona has that magical rare feeling with its own chaotic quest and storyline that wasn't given the legendary classification. And Zoroark might as well be Lucario. I put these two side by side, almost can't tell the difference. Now here comes the tricky part. If I have to pick just one, who would I pick? Realistically, Zoroark is just the easy answer because it has a movie. Volcarona is a bit rough because I feel like it's too majestic to be in a semi-pseudo-legendary Pokemon, and should just be in its own might as well be legendary category. It still fits here, however. I'm just saying, in comparison, it's really between Haxorus and Zoroark. Haxorus is definitely another go-to and would definitely be considered in the same way Gen 3 has Salamence and Metagross as 2 pseudo-legendary Pokemon. But I think the overall way Zoroark is displayed with its quest, its special characteristics, and overall gimmick gives it that Lucario main character feeling to be a Pokemon to focus on in the Gen 5 decks. So really, this is my top 3 for Gen 5 semi-pseudo-legendary Pokemon. We're getting into Gen 6 and oh my god, I can't breathe. They put Ash Greninja on this list. What is this list? I'm breathing heavy, I'm breathing heavily, and can't breathe at the same time. I need an oxygen tank. At this point, you might as well put Charizard on here. Don't you try to hide it, Pokemon fandom. I saw that, it's still on the other page. Aside from that small blunder, they do also have Noivern on here, which in all honesty is my pick for this generation. There aren't very many Pokemon to pick from in this generation. Maybe you can pick Aegislash because of how powerful yet basic it is, or Florges, as it is this 3-stage Pokemon that's a pure form of the newly introduced Fairy type in this generation. But really just any Pokemon besides a starter Pokemon, or just its form. Noivern makes a lot of sense because it is a late game dragon Pokemon that evolves at a high level and is the sort of underling dragon to Goodra, who is the pseudo-legendary of this generation. I think it's also a pretty special Pokemon that could fit into its own specialized category as it doesn't get much of a spotlight, yet has the criteria and look, and even the love to be placed in there. It's one of those hiding behind the shadow type of Pokemon that feels different in its own way as the last Pokemon before the legendaries in the Generation 6 Pokedex. Generation 7 makes no sense now that they used to have Golisopod but then they took it off. How do you take Golisopod off? That's like another Lucario or Zoroark. Are they just gonna start making up even more new categories for Generation 7? Semi-Gyarados Pokemon of each generation? Somehow all generations before this have a Semi-Pseudo Legendary, but not Gen 7? What? This page is getting to the point where they're going to make a new category about how if this Pokemon wasn't a legendary Pokemon, even though it is, it would be a Semi-Pseudo Legendary Pokemon. And then Silvally is number 1. Oh yeah, it had a pre-evolution and it is legendary, but if it wasn't, it would be here. Golisopod is literally the best choice I can pick from this generation. I mean, if you want to pick Naganadel to be here if it wasn't in its own Legendary Ultra Beast category, then Golisopod starts having some competition. But with Naganadel already being in its own category, and I guess Lycanroc being the next best substitute, I can't see any reason why Golisopod's Evil Team signature style and growing up from a Wimpod, as well as its overall demeanor, wouldn't make it the perfect candidate for this type of category. Generation 8 is truly what made this list. When I saw Copperajah, I thought to myself, wow, I have no words. And at that point I was already lying to myself like they were with this pick because I said wow and that's a word. I can see how it's hard to pick a Pokemon to fit into this category, as there are just a lot of 3-stage Pokemon that appear almost everywhere. However, I think they were close with picking a 2-stage Pokemon, just in the wrong direction. Toxtricity is my pick for this generation, as it has that Lucario vibe. And that's what this entire category is about, it's just what Pokemon are like Lucario. This is basically just the top 10 Pokemon that are like Lucario. Toxtricity did feel slightly different from the rest, and even had its own hill to die on. I do think the fact that it has a form change does take a bit away from its possession of this category's patent, as usually you just want one Pokemon to be pushed as the frontrunner. However, I think it still fits. Realistically, who is a better pick? Thievul? Authentic Poltergeist? If Urshifu wasn't a legendary Pokemon, that would be the closest pick to another Lucario. It's under 600 base stats, it has the baby pre-evolution, and looks like a completed Pokemon to fit the part. It does have 2 forms though, so now that you agreed with all the previous points that I just made, that makes Toxtricity even more viable, so there we go. I do think Toxtricity had its own spotlight and became the standout Pokemon of Generation 8, and out of all the non-categorized Pokemon, it would be very capable of taking the Semi-Pseudo Legendary Pokemon title. But again, this is a made-up category found after one Google search.